This is Review Daily, your daily dose of inspiration. This is Review Daily, yeah, an oasis of innovation for your mind, your soul, and your heart. Connect and recharge. Review Daily. This is Review.
Yes, the old times radio quality is what Yvonne calls this beautiful music. E&D, thank you. Safe travels. Where in the world are you? Do you have an idea?
The exit that says Society Road. So E&D are on Society Road, which kind of sounds like a, maybe next time we see you, I'll have a song called Society Road, Ready to Rock.
Yes, there's a song in there, Society Road. It could be a name of a new show. Next album title, thank you, Yvonne. And kudos to you. And kudos to Dario for squeezing the guitar into the jump seat. I don't know how you do this, but it somehow works. What a beautiful image. Dario, have a good concert tonight and safe travels to both of you. Love you. Take good care. And Jessica, just in case you don't know the story, Dario crashed on Eleanor's couch a few days before the pandemic hit in New York City. And we started Remote Daily together a few days after he crashed. And at the end of last year, on their final concert of the year, he proposed to her. So that's Eleanor and Dario. And it somehow reminds me a little bit of Lemonada Media, because as far as I know, you and your partner, you have never run a media company before.
No, never run a media company before, but who has really? No, I was a early producer hire at Crooked Media, which does Pod Save America, Pod Save the People. I executive produced Pod Save the People from the start. Somewhat accidentally, one of my best friends is the host of that show, DeRay McCusson, and when they were getting started, they just needed warm bodies to help make things come together. And so I kind of fell into podcasting in that way and got a chance to see a startup go from nothing to something huge, from idea to big, and also to help create a show behind the scenes, marketing it, all of it. So when Stephanie and I decided to do this one show last day, and then actually to tackle more issues than the one that affected our families in such a deep and profound and terrible way, we thought, who better to put it out than ourselves? So that's sort of how we decided to do this. And honestly, we weren't sure. Like, we knew that the issues we were talking about, everything from parenting to the opioids crisis to body image issues and beyond, in our first few shows, were affecting large numbers of people. We weren't sure how people would react to the content we were putting out there. It was very different. We don't have a deep public radio background, a deep audio production background. Stephanie's a theater director, a best-selling author, and a voice actress. I was a podcast producer, a lawyer, and a manager in the nonprofit space for decades. So we just, we were doing something very different. And this was 2019, before the pandemic. Don't know if you remember, but we were all very miserable then. We just didn't know we were about to live through a pandemic. We were like lonely, like all the numbers, lonely, depressed, anxious. Then a pandemic hit. And so people were resonating with the content in 2019. 2020 came and it was just like, whoa, this is what people needed. So we did a little bit of a raise in March 2020 so that we could bring a lot more full-timers on board. We do everything in-house, from art to distribution, now sales, and of course creating the shows themselves. And so it's been a whirlwind, both in terms of like people reacting to the content in a positive way, our growth, but also like, yeah, like having to learn how to run a startup, venture-backed media network.
Let's talk about
If
what's
anyone has
killing.
any tips, let me know. Put them in the chat.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, when I looked into Last Day and I read the about the show, it literally says, let's talk about what's killing us, the stuff that's hard to comprehend and getting worse every day. I mean, that's quite a description to start with. I think most people who start media, there's a constructivism or some optimism, kind of like a maybe an anger, but it's not like, all right, let's go full into trauma and create a conversation around that. How were you even able to do so? I mean, this is so personal to you, and then you just put it out there and start sharing it with hundreds of millions of people. Like, how does that feel when you have to do this now every day, and you have to stay in that dark place because everybody wants to stay there with you out of a sudden?
Yeah, that one show, Last Day, for sure, has dark elements to it. Not all of our slate that is that way. I mean, our good vertical, which has good kids, good sex, and we just put Good Grief out yesterday. These are 10-minute shorts that are about, you know, big topics, and by and large, they're interesting, noteworthy. Good Grief is a little bit sad, but it's also a little bit funny. Our ethos is like, you have to laugh. You have to be together to get through hard things. You have to laugh at a funeral. If anyone's ever been at a funeral or a wake or whatever the ceremony is in your culture, there's hugging and there's laughing and there's joy, because that's like the only way to get through it. So our podcasts have that feel to it. Episode 1, season 1 of Last Day, I'll give you a juxtaposition, starts with Sarah Silverman and Aziz Ansari and a lot of dick jokes, and then goes into my brother's last day of life. And that is the sort of push and pull you get with Lemonada. You're like Andy Slavitt, who's on our network now. He was the White House coronavirus person who like fixed everything, and he has a podcast with us called In the Bubble. He's out of the White House, back on Lemonada. He said, just when I think I'm going to start losing it and I can't listen anymore, Stephanie cracks a joke and I'm like back. Like just when I think I can't handle it anymore, you guys pull me from the brink. And I'm laughing about heroin overdose, which is not funny, but like we have to cope somehow. And I will tell you, I'm not a vulnerable person, or at least I was not before I lost my little brother. But like, there's something about just being taken completely down that just, you're like, well, I need people to help build me back up. So this was a coping mechanism for me that I do not recommend. We went to Boston and recreated my brother Stefano's last day with a production team over the course of 3 straight days. Total trauma reaction, like 1,000% not the right thing to do. But it's what I did, and I felt compelled by it. It was incredibly cathartic and challenging. But we did that in 2019. It is now 2021, and it was a great coping mechanism for me. Our central question for that season of Last Day was, could we have saved our brothers? We have 2 type A, big sisters, families that, were as good as could be, though flawed. 2 bright boys, both died in their 30s. Harris won an Emmy after he died. He is the executive producer of Parks and Rec. He wrote Master of None. He was going to star in Master of None with Aziz, and died 3 days before moving to New York. Like these were 2 boys who had everything. If it could happen to us, it could happen to anyone. So we just put it out there, and we were like, what could we have done differently if through the course of this podcast, we knew what we knew and our brothers were still alive? And, it is now being taught the podcast is being used as a curriculum for like pharmacological schools, the entire state of Colorado. People are using it to talk openly about opioid use disorder in their families and understand that like and if anyone is on this call, the shortest answer, like you can save your person, they will be on medically assisted treatment for the rest of their lives, or you will be on medically assisted treatment for the rest of your lives. And that's okay. You can live like a perfectly good life with a good job and be on methadone or Suboxone or another treatment. And also it takes about 5 years to really be in remission from this kind of brain disorder, which is what it is. But we didn't know that. Like we just were like, oh my God, you should go to rehab and then stop using heroin, please. And that just doesn't work. So, for us, it felt like, shoot, I wish we never had to make this show, but we did. It was like in our bodies, we got it out. I don't live in that dark place most of the time anymore. And the network is not in that dark place. We have as many light shows as we have heavy ones. And even when we're dealing with heavy issues like the childcare crisis, we're doing them with funny people like Kristen Bell, who's on that show with us, who does like a whole hilarious lecture about Richard Nixon and how he ruined early childhood education in America. So we try to keep it light, we try to keep it accessible, and we try to keep it solutions oriented as opposed to just mucking around in the misery.
So you bring comedy to tragedy. They've always been related in a way, but how do you decide like that huge thing to be a show? Like what is it that a problem like the opioid crisis or childcare, like what makes you decide, yes, we do a show on this? Because right now you're on a run, like you're putting shows out every day. So I wonder if you have like a formula for that by now.
Yeah, some of it is opportunity, like people coming to us with great ideas. A lot of it is generated in-house by this simple question of, is there a big problem that's affecting a lot of people that nobody's talking about in a solutions-oriented way?
Okay.
And is that, is it affecting a lot of people in a truly negative way? Like mosquitoes affect a lot of people, but we're not going to make a podcast about it. Opioids crisis, suicide crisis, childcare crisis, poverty crisis. That's affecting a lot of people in a pretty gnarly way, affecting people's daily lives, affecting the broader community around them. And so that's a space where Lemonada can sit uniquely and create these first-person narrative series that are solutions-oriented and entertaining.
Yeah, exactly. Leave the mosquito podcast to Radio Lab.
Exactly.
Who needs that on Lemonada? But what are the big problems that no one talks about that you haven't made a show out of yet? What are the ones that you're planning on right now? Because obviously the world is full of them. For example, is climate a topic to podcast on?
Yeah, we've got, you guys tell us. I don't know what's messing you up. We've got climate change on the horizon this year. So as I mentioned, we just put out a podcast around the prison system, and countless people are affected. And when we think about who's affected, we think about like the person, like the substance use disorder sufferer, or the person who is incarcerated or whatever. And then we think about their entire universe. Like there's usually 5 people around them at least, whose lives are completely upturned by the issue, or the childcare crisis for that matter. There's a parent or a child, and then there's the world around them. So you can just sort of amplify how many people are in prison, how many people are affected by the prison system each year at any given time. We're there trying to cover it in a way that's helpful and solutions oriented. Our grief podcast we put out just now because we know the entire country's in grief, the entire world's in grief right now, in the midst of it and trying to process. So it's a 10-minute episodes, all released on the same day on August 3rd. So it's a 60-minute binge listen that sort of takes you through different phases of grief and different types of grief. People who've lost people suddenly or over time or to COVID. It's beautifully scored. It's sort of like an audio immersion into what grief actually feels like. We are coming out with a comedy podcast a month from now called I'm Sorry. You will appreciate that there are 200 million podcasts and literally not one called I'm Sorry. And I think it's a testament to a culture that doesn't like to apologize. So we grabbed the RSS feed a couple of months ago, which is like the little, it says like /I'm sorry, Apple podcast, Spotify podcast /I'm sorry, and didn't release any content in it except a little placeholder. And before we even told people who was going to be on the show, which we haven't announced yet, 3 comedians of color, talking about everything from cancel culture to the latest like big public gaffes to personal issues and whether people ought to apologize and how. So it's funny, but sometimes tackling serious topics. Thousands and thousands of downloads already, and we haven't even put out content because people are just like, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about like, do we need to say we're sorry? What does it mean to say you're sorry? Chrissy Teigen, the Me Too, Time's Up, all of it. Racism, institutional, day-to-day, or are we apologizing for things? Are we teaching critical race theory in schools? Let's talk about it. Later this year, we're talking about the many women who face domestic violence and are incarcerated for self-defense and don't have viable self-defense in the American criminal justice system because you have to be literally being strangled in order to defend yourself against your abuser. You can't be like afraid that in an hour he might do something. And then at the end of this year, we have a fictional series, our first one coming out about the thorny middle school years. So it's entirely casted with young actors who are in middle school, who are dealing with everything from religious conflict to getting their first period in middle school. And it's with Hillary Frank, who's a phenomenal writer and one of the top parenting podcasters of all time. She did a show called The Longest Shortest Time. So we're, you tell me what, yeah, man, the world is screwed up. There are a lot of good people in it. We really have just started as a species addressing how traumatizing living is. And, I think it's good that we're talking about it, but it's also messy. And so we're creating a little niche for doing it in this podcasting way.
Fantastic. Kudos, congratulations. Yeah, I was just looking at you, Yvonne, when I read your comment. Yvonne is a podcaster as well. Yvonne, when you hear Jessica speak, what comes to mind for you as someone who has entered the podcasting world after or while pursuing a career in photography? What is your point when you hear the USP that Lemonada puts out there?
Oh man, I just how can I up my game? That's what comes to mind. Yeah. Wanting to dig into people's stories in an honest way, which I haven't listened to any of your podcasts. I don't know of them, and I'm a podcast junkie, so I'm going to have to dive in clearly. I'm very excited.
Thank you, Yvonne. But as a podcast producer, Jessica, is there actually advice that you give out? I mean, you have been obviously producing some of the most successful podcasts in the world before Lemonada even. Is there advice that you give out for all these people right now that are taking the lower technical barrier and saying, of course I'm going to podcast? What do you usually recommend?
I mean, the short answer is it depends. So if someone's got a passion and then they want to get it out there and they just need to create art around it, I love podcasting as a medium for doing that in a very quick way. Part of the reason Stephanie and I chose it was because it felt like, something we'd both had experience in. She's a voice actress and I was a podcast producer, but also the barrier to entry wasn't wildly high. We produce high-end content, so it's not like cheap to make. It's not like your typical just like 2 people chatting, low editing kind of thing. But those podcasts are okay and great, and there's a place for them. So if you've got something in you that you need to get out, even if one person listens, I think it could be worth it. And if you really want to not necessarily have like some huge mega hit fresh air type podcast, but if you want to have develop a core audience for a topic that you're passionate about, check and see what's out there first. Like if you wanted to do like a Harry Potter podcast, you better go look. There's 400 million of them. Not actually, but maybe you want to do one that's super specific. And I there's a lot of banter like, oh, there's too many podcasts. Like who says there's too many books? Who says there's too many? Nobody says that. There's not too many podcasts. It's just like the Wild West. So it's hard to figure out where to find them and all of that. But like find your people, figure out what problem you want to solve, either for yourself or others. Doesn't have to be a big Lemonada type problem. It could be like, there's no podcast about female Dungeons and Dragons players. I'm sure there is actually. So I want to start it. But I think podcasting is great. I don't think there are enough podcasts yet. I think it's a really fun media space to be in because you can break through, and the cost of entry is not prohibitive the way film and TV and books can be.
But I have to say though, the hardest thing that I find about podcasting, part of the reason why everything on my end is so difficult, because I'm teaching at journalism school this week, and of course a lot of young journalists are looking into that field. One of the hardest thing I find about podcasting is the fact that it seems like an Olympic game. You are doing all the work, and you get amazing guests, and you prepare your interview, and you record, and even the recording goes well, and then you edit and you put all the work into the script, and it's hours and days, and then you just have a little audio file. And then comes, oh yeah, what is the branding like? What's the color? What's the logo? What's the claim? What's the website? Oh, social media. It's like, it's everything at once. And I find that incredibly hard for anyone who is starting out, even though the barrier looks so low. To me, it seems like it's incredibly high. How have you dealt with that, especially when you started out? Like, how did you deal with the fact that this is actually not an easy business at all?
Yes, we have been able to successfully cut through the noise for a new media company, and it is, sometimes people are like, "What's the secret?" And I'm like, "There's no secret. It's like a list of 100 things that you literally have to do every single time and hope one of them works." And in startup world, we talk about like quick failure, move on. So like it's not, but that list doesn't like change because one podcast doesn't do exactly what the other podcast will do. So like a particular set of actions that I do for podcast 1, if I try to do them exactly the same for podcast 2, it's a different show, so it's not going to work quite the same. So we're constantly trying to calibrate. But yeah, I mean, we have to. Someone asked about finding the audience and all of that. It is true that there's a repeatable thing that has to happen for every show, from creative brief to figuring out what could be sticky marketing materials, show logo, description. Like someone's going to go, they're going to, oh, let me click on that logo. Let me read about it. And we're all like skeptics, right? Like you don't actually want a new TV show to watch unless someone tells you 15 times to watch it, or you see it at 15 times, you finally click, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, that actually sounds good. So you really have to think about that thought process for each different property every single time. And then you have to get the platforms. Like I don't work for Apple, I don't work for Spotify. I have to work with them and give them content that they want to feature because it's interesting, diverse, relevant to their audience, potentially sticky. So we've got to do all the things every single time in a nuanced way for every single property. And right now we're doing that once a month. So it's exhausting. I mean, I would say for most people, like if you have a show idea, podcast idea, or currently have a podcast, really, really try to figure out what's going to keep people retained and what's going to get people to click in the first place. And the best things in life are free. Like discovery is largely word of mouth and getting featured by in the podcast world platforms, or sometimes earned media as well.
Jessica, I'm so grateful for your generosity and time, and I want to end on a personal question about grief. We here on Remote Daily, we had a number of conversations. We're actually still in the middle of it, kind of like a mini series about grief, and we started it together with a NASA astrophysicist called Michelle Thaler, who actually used to have her own podcast and is having millions of views online. She's one of the best storytellers we've ever had the chance to meet here on this humble format. And she lost her husband actually around the time the pandemic began, and entered this stage of grief, this first stage, I guess, all by herself. And she came here to talk about it, and she went with us through this time, and she talked about the untalkable, the what comes after life, and what she thinks as a scientist, and what others think in our community around this topic, and how she deals with the fact that she has to grieve, and she is just doing it by herself. And one thing that we learned from her is that it seems to never end, but like is like a roller coaster, and the stages are wildly different and they just hit you. And I really wonder, you know, with all the work that you do and that you have done with Stephanie, with sharing this faith, this belief also that talking about it is good and putting out there is good. I wonder what stage you are in right now, because obviously it led you to where you are today. So I would love to know how you personally deal with your own grief and what stage you feel you're in at the moment.
Yeah. You know, it's not as raw as it was. Like I often talk about it as volume. Like in the beginning when my brother first died, it was just like screaming volume. Like this is all I can think about at all times. And then it starts to like come down, and I can have other things be in my thoughts. But it doesn't really go away. I think most people who talk about grief these days, it's not a linear process. Like you still have these moments of like complete disbelief and shock, even 3 years later for me, or just sadness or unacceptance. There's also a writer who's about to start a new podcast with us. Her name is Claire Bidwell Smith, who talks about the missing stage of grief, which is anxiety. So if anyone's ever gone through a sudden loss in particular, but really any kind of loss, it's the idea like the rug could just be pulled out from you at any moment and totally shatter your life. And that's like, yeah, you're sad, you miss your person, but also you feel like nothing is safe. And so that's a stage of grief that we often talk about at Lemonada. Claire's got a new show coming out with us this fall that you can actually listen to the trailer for called New Day. So it's sort of the yin to last day's yang, which is, I think, a nice way to wrap up the answer to your question, Felix. Last day is like what happens when everything goes wrong in our society. We end up with massive health epidemics. New Day is like, how do we create lives worth living in the most basic ways at the outset? So sort of upstream interventions versus those late stream interventions. And I feel like I'm there. I'm like trying to be in that space. I'm like, let's make the world less shitty so that more people don't have to go through what we went through. We know the opioids crisis has gotten worse, not better, during the pandemic. So we feel like the work has just begun. And I think our grief fuels us every single day, but it's not as screaming loud as it once was.
Wow. Jessica Cordova Kramer, everybody. This is your virtual glitter, Jessica, just for you, from all of us.
You guys are very sweet.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come on an entirely improvised edition of Remote Daily.